Dear friends, we are all aware of what's happened in Bangladesh, and to speak about the critical situation in the country, we have with us Professor Harsh V Pant, who is a well-known international expert, international relations expert, and also with he's with the Observer Research Foundation, which is a leading think tank in India. Professor Pant, thank you so much for joining us today.
Pleasure to be here.
Professor Pant, let's start with what's happening in Bangladesh. I mean, because if prima facie, if you look at it, Sheikh Hasina, she literally pulled Bangladesh out of abject poverty. Bangladesh has been one of the fastest growing economies in the world under her rule. In fact, as of today, I think Bangladesh's per capita income is slightly higher than even India's GDP per capita income, per capita income. And it seemed that, there was some degree of stability in Bangladesh. It has had coups in the past, but one had assumed that there's a degree of stability there. So, what has happened? And let's start with what this means for Bangladesh, and then we'll cover the wider region.
Pallavi, this I think it poses some serious questions for Bangladesh's future. Because as you were pointing out, before Sheikh Hasina took over, around 15 years back, Bangladesh had gone through lots of turbulence, political turbulence, a lot of political polarization, a lot of military coups. So there was an inherent political instability in the system. And what Sheikh Hasina did, at least to begin with, she gave Bangladesh political stability, and on the back of that political stability came economic vitality. So you saw Bangladesh, as you were mentioning, becoming an economic powerhouse and becoming an exemplar for the developing world. Uh, because the policy processes and the political processes provided it a certain kind of stability. And I think it certainly at this point, when we can blame everything on Sheikh Hasina, it's fashionable. It's fashionable to criticize her, but I think it is also true that she did a lot of good for Bangladesh, and she did a lot of good for the region, because let's also remember that South Asia is a very volatile region. So to have a country like Bangladesh take charge of its future, take with confidence, do well economically, work well with its neighbors, fashioning a broader consensus around its developmental priorities was a big deal. And I think in some ways her approach to governance may have had its faults, but it allowed Bangladesh to fulfill some of those potential, inherent potential that people often talked about. And therefore, I think it would be very difficult now for Bangladesh to sort of get back on track economically if the present trends continue. Because at the moment, of course, there is a lot of anger against Sheikh Hasina. There is a lot of anger against the government, and unfortunately, it is being demonstrated in ways that are, often also very sad. Because when you see Bangabandhu's, statue being, targeted, he was, after all, the father of Bangladesh in more ways than one. So I think there is a sense of perhaps vindication and rightful at that being felt by some people, that look, we have gotten rid of Sheikh Hasina. But the real question starts now. What now? How can you? That's the easy part in some ways. Getting rid of Sheikh Hasina, she's gone. She's, as her son is telling, I think, the media, she won't be back as a political figure. But the future of Bangladesh is certainly at stake. And while we have a interim government being shaped by the military, the center of gravity of Bangladeshi politics has shifted to the right. So you will have extremist groups also becoming part of the government. We know that Jamaat also might see its fortunes in a different way now, and BNP itself had become a lot more extremist than in the past. In order to take on Sheikh Hasina, that was a political strategy being deployed by BNP. So I think that the challenge first is for Bangladesh to decide which way it wants to go, as a country that continues to adhere to its progressive sentiment, or as a country that is now where the extremist wing takes over, and that the direction completely gets derailed. So I think there is a lot here to unpack, both economically, politically, governance-wise. How do you get democracy back on track? I think all those questions are vital questions for Bangladesh and people of Bangladesh to answer.
Yeah, and as you mentioned that the attack on Mujibur Rahman's statues, Banga Bandhu, the larger question is that now what happens to the India-Bangladesh story, because the relationship between the two countries had really taken off, and it is a well-established fact that the Awami League and Sheikh Hasina were more secular, liberal oriented. I mean, in the context of Bangladeshi politics, and now one does not know, who's going to fill that vacuum, and there's always also been this issue of attack on minorities, on the Hindu minority there. And, so in the larger context now, how do you see this shaping up for India? How is India going to deal with this, given that it already has two sensitive borders to deal with? Now, this development, how do you see this for India specifically?
I think very challenging times for India-Bangladesh relations, and for India now to think of, it's more than 4,000 kilometers border that it shares with Bangladesh. That's going to be very volatile. It has always been easy to say for the last 15 odd years that, look, we have a stable government in Bangladesh that knows that is cognizant of Indian concerns. Now you have suddenly a void. We don't know what kind of governance structure will emerge, and I think the challenge for both India and Bangladesh we have discussed, but for India will continue, because there are going to be questions related to, as you mentioned, minority rights in Bangladesh. There are going to be questions about Awami League, supporters of Awami League being targeted. That question will become very important, and how the government, military government at the moment handles that, because there'll be temptation to go after Awami League supporters. And let's not forget that there is, given that Awami League had been in power for the last 15 odd years, more than 15 years, there'll be, all the institutions will have Awami supporters. So are we saying that, we are going to dismantle all those institutions? So I think the questions are very significant, and what happens within Bangladesh will have an impact on the border, will have an impact on migration issues. Again, the bordering area with India-Bangladesh border has always been very sensitive. If you have migration happening, in India, it will change the demography, and I think the questions that many Indians have been asking, they will also once again become very, very, very palpable, and the tensions are only going to rise. If the government in Bangladesh doesn't decide to deal with them sensitively, if they don't acknowledge Indian sensitivities, then I think there will be a problem. And for India, the question is, how can we best manage and steer Bangladesh now, given that it is in India's interest, as you rightly point out, that we should have a stable Bangladesh, we should have a economically developed, economically prosperous Bangladesh. But at the moment, it is in Bangladesh's hands. We are all hearing all kinds of stories about who will be part of the interim government, and how that interim government then evaluates what has happened so far. Will they take an adversarial view on everything that Sheikh Hasina has done? And as we were discussing, she has done so much good work also. So there is a question now of how the government that is formed, how they take on issues of development and governance and politics and economics, and how they engage with India. With India, the challenge is, of course, the border, migration, insurgents in the northeast, India's connectivity projects. India has been engaged in a number of connectivity projects. India has been engaged in multimodal connectivity with Bangladesh. We have had rail connectivity, land, air, inland waterways. And I think the relationship really flowered in the last few decades. So I think, are we going to see a turning back on that? Because that would impact, of course, India will be impacted. India's northeast will be impacted. But Bangladesh will be impacted much more seriously, because Bangladesh's economy is not doing well at the moment. And these crises have accelerated the economic challenges. So I think in theory, it makes sense for both countries to work together, both governments to continue to work together. But in practice, what we don't know as of yet is what kind of governmental priorities will we see in Dhaka emerging, and whether those priorities will be in sync with Indian priorities.
Yeah, and and if one goes back to these protests, now we saw that there were these protests. In fact, a couple of months ago, there were some protests regarding boycotting Indian products, and then there's been this tension simmering, and then one also had these reports of allegedly America getting interested in Bangladeshi domestic politics, and one cannot forget the coup in Iran in 1953 when Mohammad Mossadegh was removed in the so-called protests. Now, in these protests, do you see an element of maybe an external country, maybe America? Some people speculate it could be China, because Sheikh Hasina, prima facie seen, was a leader who stood up to bigger countries and not one to be just pushed aside. Do you reckon that besides maybe there could be some underlying simmering anger, because obviously there is a factor of incumbency, anti-incumbency, when someone is in government for a long time, but do you reckon that there is more here than meets the eye, given the kind of bloody protests, the kind of violence that is being seen on the streets of Dhaka?
See, there's certainly no doubt that there is more here than meets the eye, and I think in some ways the tensions, the disaffection vis-a-vis Sheikh Hasina was simmering under the surface. I think people were unhappy that there are no alternative modes of expressing themselves. Right, political parties have been banned, leaders have been put behind bars, media was being targeted. So there was a sense that, look, we also want to express ourselves in ways that perhaps allows for that democratic norms to be established, and that was not happening. People were also, I think, there was a discontent brewing because of the economic problems that were inherent in Bangladesh. I think unemployment was extremely high, has been extremely high for some time, and I think there was a discontent with the way economic governance was happening. The inequality was increasing, socioeconomic inequality was increasing, and so all of these challenges were there. I don't think it is anyone can make a case that Sheikh Hasina was in any way perfect prime minister. She had several problems. She had several challenges, but I think what is surprising, as you point out rightly in this case, is that this particular episode, which was about quotas, it was not of Sheikh Hasina's making, nor was she different in her attitude than the protesters. In fact, the quota came from the courts, and the quota was decided by the courts. Then the courts decided to take away that quota, and she was, implementing what the courts was asking the government to do. And in some ways, she was also very similar in her views as the protesters were. So it is very intriguing that an issue in which she was willing to side with the protesters, on an issue on which she was largely a bystander, where the courts were deciding the courts, suddenly it became such a huge issue. Of course, you had security forces and how they dealt with it. There were excesses that were committed, and that also led to people getting even more angry than at her. But I do think that if you think in the context of the challenges that are being faced, this was perhaps not the biggest challenge in that context. The two sides could have easily resolved it. As till the last minute, she was saying, "I'm willing to sit with the protesters and sort it out." Maybe it was too late for the protesters, but I think the way the protest unfolded, the way violence was used, the way security forces were targeted initially, I think it does tell you that there was something else happening, and that there were beyond the student-led protests that everyone was told these are. There were elements at play here that are that perhaps historians would be able to factor in later. But certainly on this particular issue, it doesn't seem to be the most vital of issues where you would see Sheikh Hasina getting deposed. If she could survive the pressure during the elections, I think it also lulled many people into confidence that she would survive this, because at the time of elections earlier this year, there was enormous pressure on her, and she survived that pressure. And 6-7 months down the line, suddenly the issue becomes a different one. But what is true is that a student protest morphed into one where the political entities, political parties, Jamaat and BNP, decided to take, to make it political, and to push this conversation. And certainly there are other actors. I think it's very difficult to figure out whether which external parties were engaged. But I think one particular country that certainly benefits is Pakistan, Pakistani intelligence have had long desired to play a role in Bangladesh. And you would recall before Sheikh Hasina came to power, a number of groups have been fostering in Bangladesh that had the support of ISI, that had the support of Pakistan's military intelligence complex, which they wanted to create a two-front situation for India, both on the eastern and the western flanks. And I do think that that in this case now, as we look at extremist groups dominating the discourse, certainly there would be you would see, or you are likely to see Pakistan playing a much more prominent role in that regard. Whether other actors were involved, I think that is something which we do not have any evidence to suggest at this point. But if you go by the logic, then certainly one country that might benefit out of this would be China. That you would see benefits accruing to China if the government of the day, the new government, interim government, decides that perhaps Sheikh Hasina's outreach to India has not benefited Bangladesh and they need to move towards China, then I think China will be a beneficiary. China has always expressed its concerns. You would recall just days back, Sheikh Hasina was in China, a visit that she had to cut short actually. But she went to China. She had been trying to navigate a delicate balance between India and China. But even China, ultimately would want a stable Bangladesh where there will be political stability, where if at all it is to gain economic advantage out of Bangladesh, then it doesn't need a chaotic Bangladesh. It needs a Bangladesh that can make things work. So I doubt very much that the present situation is in Chinese favor. But eventually, once things settle down, maybe you will see that back and forth emerging in that context.
Yeah. And just last two questions, Professor Pant, that in the larger context of geopolitics, we already have Russia, Ukraine, we already have Israel and Iran, in a very, very volatile situation. And now suddenly we have, Bangladesh in this situation. Do you think that this conflict or what's happening in Bangladesh actually can have repercussions beyond the Indian subcontinental geopolitics? Do you think that this could have far more serious consequences which are not apparent right now?
Certainly, I think one of the things that Bangladesh, was becoming very central to was this wider dynamic in the Indo-Pacific, where in the Bay of Bengal, Bangladesh has such an important position. Now, if you have a country that is politically stable, and where there is economic resurgence, and it is working in tandem with India, then you do see that certain advantages coming not only to Bangladesh but to the entire region. And then in the wider context of the Indo-Pacific, that Bay of Bengal is today at the heart of that debate. So certainly, if you have a situation where a country like Bangladesh, a moderate Islamic state, moving towards extremism, a state with its democratic credentials becoming chaotic, becoming unruly, becoming ungovernable, where political institutions collapse and where the economic resurgence takes a backseat. I think there are a number of countries that are likely to benefit because of that. And I think then you can look at it in the wider geopolitics of the world, that as crises multiply across the world, having another crisis in the Bay of Bengal is certainly something that actually no one needs, but there is very little that anyone can do to prevent that from happening. Because ultimately, this is a decision of the people of Bangladesh and how they have to govern themselves. So therefore, I said at the very beginning that it is now up to the people of Bangladesh to decide how they want to take their governance forward. Because now that Sheikh Hasina is gone, the anger issue should now lead to something more productive. And if it does not, then there are consequences for Bangladesh, for India-Bangladesh relations, but also for South Asia, Bay of Bengal, and Indo-Pacific. Because here is a country that we had looked at as a moderate Islamic democracy, which is capable of governing, and not only governing, but governing well. But now that country is facing those kinds of challenges, which therefore allow it to become a pawn in the larger geopolitical game that we are witnessing being played by major powers.
One last question, Professor Pant. Do you think India could have done anything at all? Is it in a way a strategic failure for India? Because Sheikh Hasina really, if you see this was a very important relationship for India, not just on a country level, but even between the leaders. And Sheikh Hasina enjoys a very good relation even with the Gandhi family. So overall, do you see this? Could this be said that this is a failure for India? That there wasn't really much that India could do, because India is not really known to interfere in other countries' politics and internal affairs. But was there anything that India could do, and how can India now prepare for a country, a neighboring country, another country where, let's hope not, but there's a possibility that one could have a adversarial kind of a government?
See, I think to be on the safe side, India should prepare for the worst, and that the worst can happen. That you can have a government that is vitriolically anti-India. That is a possibility, and also the possibility that you will have mal governance becoming a feature of Bangladesh. I'm just laying this out because that's a distinct possibility. It may or may not happen, and God forbid it. That it may happen. But I think that possibility exists because that space, the secular liberal space that Awami League used to enjoy, that space is vacant, and that space is not being filled by any other actor. Whereas the drift of the Bangladesh is towards extremism. And I think that's very, very challenging and very, very disconcerting for India. Now, one of the things that India perhaps will have to do is to, of course, engage with whosoever is in power. Indians don't get to vote in Bangladesh, and Bangladesh, of course, doesn't get to vote in India. So we have to deal with whoever comes to power. But the issue, I think, for India is always very delicate when it comes to neighboring countries. If India involves itself too much, if
Hmm.
India starts saying, "Oh, we want this to happen, that to happen," then India is blamed for being this overbearing big brother. And if
Hmm.
India keeps its hands off, as India seems to have done now, India is often castigated, and many in Bangladesh today are castigating India that look, India did not do enough. In India did not stand up for democracy, etc. But ultimately, India's position has always remained that it is for Bangladesh to decide which way it wants to go. Now, what certainly, given the close relations that India enjoyed with Bangladesh, what India could have done, at least in the last few months, is to alert Sheikh Hasina to the possibility that this kind of discontent is brewing, and it can have long-term consequences. Therefore, it would have been prudent for Sheikh Hasina to perhaps handle some of these crises differently. She handled this crisis. She came to the realization very late that this is getting out of hand. Perhaps had she seen at the very beginning that this is a crisis that is going to be very serious, she could have handled it much better. I think that is where perhaps in India could have intervened, nudged, not intervened, nudged Sheikh Hasina. But again, I think the issues remain that at the moment, given India's strong support for Sheikh Hasina over the course of the last few years, India will be seen as a party to this, and India, for most Bangladeshis, India would also be seen as a country that did not support them during the democratic movement as they see it for a lot of them. But I think India also needs interlocutors. If you say that India should have been engaged with all stakeholders, then the question is who those stakeholders are. India is not going to engage with Jamaat Islami, which continues to castigate India day in and day out. It's openly anti-India. So what is there to engage with? But there is BNP, for example. India had always engaged with the BNP, but the BNP itself had drifted towards extremism in the last few years and had taken positions, as you were mentioning earlier, India Out campaign, or similar to what was happening in Maldives. It was BNP that was leading the charge. So certainly India's space to maneuver was relatively limited in that context. Now, hindsight is a great thing. We can all look at it and say this could have been done better. But I think broadly, if you look at the last 15 years, they have been a period where Bangladesh has benefited, given where it went economically, and India-Bangladesh ties have become stronger. The future now depends on Bangladesh itself, whether it wants the future to be disruptive, or whether it wants the future to take the best of what Sheikh Hasina offered over the last 15 years and make the most of it.
Yeah, and one could clearly see the chemistry between Prime Minister Modi and Sheikh Hasina as well. And I think now but a lot will probably depend on the Bangladeshi army as well. So if just I know I said the previous was the last question, but just a bit on the Bangladeshi army. I mean, is it secular? Is it more like the Pakistani army? I mean, what is the composition of that army? Because I think that they are going to play a important role going forward.
No, Bangladeshi army is a professional army, and I think they have had great interactions in terms of the institutional arrangements. India and Bangladesh's armies have been interacting very, very regularly. And Bangladesh armies, I don't think Bangladesh army would be, of course, in the past there have been many coups in Bangladesh, military coups. But Bangladesh army has become over a period of time much more mature in terms of accepting the logic that militaries are not there to run states. And I think if at all Pakistan stands out as an example of what military should not be doing. So I think Bangladesh army has learned certainly the right lessons. But see, the problem is it is Bangladesh army can today give a sense of stability and can be the guarantor of an interim government. But if that interim government becomes incapable of leading on its own, then what recourse does Bangladeshi army has? They will have to continue to be the guarantor, and I think they will have to continue to govern, and that would be again a failure of Bangladesh's democracy, because Bangladesh democracy has always thrived. Now, in the absence of a governable coalition, a governing coalition, Bangladesh army would also have lots of constraints to deal with. So I think what will be interesting to see as to what kind of an interim government is constituted, because a lot would depend on how they go about running the government. If the interim government is not cohesive, if it is not sound policy wise, if it is only vindictive, if it is only regressive, if it is only about the composition is driven by extremist elements, then I think Bangladeshi army might be tempted to stay in power for much longer than perhaps they're anticipating now, because for them stability in Bangladesh is going to be very, very crucial.
Professor Pant, thank you for taking your time and for speaking with us. Thank you so much for all your insights on the Bangladesh crisis. Thank you so much.
Thank you, madam.